Hello, my name is Dube, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and a professor of clinical psychology. Today, I will be talking with Dr. Victoria Doobay. I'm so excited to have this conversation with her.
Hello, welcome to our podcast on culturally responsive clinical supervision. My name is Sue Bay. Today's guest is Dr. Victoria Dube, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and supervisor at DePaul Family and Community Services, otherwise known as FCS. She obtained her master's and doctoral degrees at the School and Applied Child Psychology program at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. At FCS, Victoria provides individual, family, and group therapy to children, adolescents, and families, both in the clinic and community settings. She also conducts and supervises psychological assessments. Victoria holds a growth mindset in regards to the mental health field and is an active advocate for decolonization and diversity trainings for FCS students and staff. Her clinical interests are related to how developmental trauma, intersection of identities, and systemic structures impact personal and collective well-being. Victoria provides support using holistic strategies for mind, body, and spirit, such as mindfulness, yoga and body awareness and movement, art and music expression, cognitive strategies, and humanism. Dr. Dube, welcome. We're very excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. Well, shall we begin?
Sounds great.
Yeah. So the first question we had for you is, what's it been like for you to be a supervising psychologist of color in the context of racism, equity, and social responsibility over the years? What has changed since you first began your career?
Yes, thank you for asking this important question. I've been thinking about my response to this, and I would say over the past year especially, it was very difficult for me. I think there was just between the pandemic and everything going on in the world and our country, I faced a lot of different types of emotions last year. So it felt like a bit like a roller coaster at times. So I think it's been this way for all the years that I've been supervising, but especially salient last year. So I felt like I was doing my own deep dive and exploring crevices, dismissed areas within my own being and ways in which maybe I've have internalized colonialization within myself. And I also wanted to try to best support my students. Last year, especially 4 of my 5 students are people of color. And so I wanted to support their own processes while recognizing that we might share collective experiences, trauma, or grief responses, but there are going to be differences there and differences in how we experience it and differences in identities that are more salient for each of us. So it became a bit of this balancing act, I would say. And I would say, especially last year, my supervising team became a really safe processing space, especially because we started virtual therapy and we had spent maybe about 4 or 5 months together in person. And we knew how each person responded verbally and non-verbally. And it was nice to be able to take that into the virtual space. And we were able to dive into hold pain together. And then we also use the pain often in the supervision space to help us think of ways that we can transform the pain. And that became really powerful. It felt like a huge empowerment, sort of like a metamorphosis.
Yeah.
And I think that was a process that I really enjoyed. And I don't think I realized that supervision could be like that. It's like it could be a holding space, but can it also be such a big transformation space, both personally and professionally? So like looking at clinical identities, but looking at it on a collective scale, like how this affects our clients and the institution of psychology in general.
Mhm. Yes, I'm all about transformation, and I would love to hear more about that, especially what you pointed out, how you were able to transform pain, which all of us have felt in the past couple of years, for your not only for yourself but also for your supervisees. That's really wonderful that you were able to do that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I think that there were moments of pain where it felt daunting to sit in it all the time. And just the grief it was just so grief ridden that I think it reached a point where it hurt too much to sit in it. And
Mhm.
I think at a certain point, my team and I kind of felt like, okay, we have this, we know this, it's incredibly painful. Each person on the team is experiencing different levels of pain or different reasons why they're in pain. They're holding their clients' pain as well. And I think it reached a point where we were like, okay, well, how do we release this? Is there some kind of outlet here? Because
Mhm.
it isn't sustainable to swim around in it only.
Yes, yes. Yeah, that's really important. I'm really glad that you were able to do that with your supervisees. Maybe it'll come up more as we talk more about your experience. Have you had, so it sounds like you probably have, but I'll ask it again. Have you had the opportunity to do your own work regarding racism and identity? And maybe you could share with us some examples as well. And how has that work changed the way you work with your supervisees? How do you manage your own reactions during the supervisory process?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I've definitely had the opportunity to do my own work, but then also kind of lean into the belief that I have that it's lifelong work, that it's sort of an evolution. And I think I've uncovered layers that I didn't know were possible, which is really cool. And it first started, I would say, maybe rather intuitively when I was younger and being sort of a child of color in a suburb that didn't necessarily have a lot of people that looked
Mhm.
like me. So there was sort of like some level of intuitive awareness when comments or jokes or microaggressions were made. So I didn't know the term microaggression, but I knew it landed funny. I'm just like, oh, I don't like how
Yeah,
that
yeah.
feels for me. Or if it was made for against someone else, I'm like, oh, like that lands funny too. Like I don't think that was an okay thing to say to somebody. And I would say it was more in grad school, having the privilege of going to grad school. It was more in grad school where I was able to link these kinds of experiences to terminology or concepts and
Mhm.
gain more of that conceptual understanding. And that, like, it was life changing. I think taking that multiculturalism class in grad school was, whew, it was heavy. It was
Yeah,
life changing. And
yeah.
I felt like I started unlearning many of the things I had internalized. And at first I was like, wait, what? Like I'm confused. I didn't know that I operated like this. And so I was looking at internalized racism within myself or internalized sexism, a denial or dismissal of my own cultural roots, and behaviors I had done when I was a kid that would deny me from that. So like even something that sounds as simple as like not wanting to take the food my mom cooked me to
Mhm.
school. Um,
Mhm.
and like now I'm like, oh, like I wish I could eat her food every day.
Yes, yeah.
And yeah, so I think that was painful, but then it also got me really serious in knowing myself. And so
Mhm.
exploring my areas of privilege and not shying away from that. And then also areas that are more challenging or more marginalized for me, I would say. And then I started asking myself, I'm like, okay, with this newfound self awareness, what do I do with it in the field? How does that impact my work with clients or even how I conceptualize what's going on for clients? And then how do I work with my supervisees?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's such an important point about internalized racism, right? I to relate to your experience in that as a person of color, I think we are told so many different things from very early on that we can't help but internalize some of those messages. And it's incredibly hard to unlearn those as well.
Oh, I completely agree. I find new layers all the time, and I'm like,
Yes.
oh, and it's so enlightening each time. As
Mhm.
much as it's painful, I'm like, wow, like I feel like I've cleared out something else within me each time. And
Mhm.
I think over the pandemic, especially leaning into this idea of colonization for myself, I think like that's where a lot of my work has been currently in for me. My parents are they were born and raised in Guyana in South America.
Mhm.
And so I identify as an Indo-Caribbean Canadian. And
Mhm.
but then if we trace my ancestry back, it's to India. And I
Oh,
feel so,
wow.
yeah, I feel so disconnected from India because I think great grandparents came over on ships as indentured laborers. And it sort of created a new iteration of like different, I guess, our culture and
Mhm.
our religions. And I think it's been really hard to know or feel that sense of belonging. I'm like, okay, I feel like I belong in Guyana, but when I go there, I don't belong
Mhm.
there.
Mhm.
And I feel like my theme right now for my own work that's coming out for me and with my work with students is coming home to myself. So
Mhm.
I'm
Mhm.
just like, wait, like what's at my core here? Like, how do I connect maybe all the way back to ancestry? So I've been doing more research on maybe where my family might come from in India.
Mhm.
And I started doing some yoga teacher training, which I feel like
Oh,
has really connected me on a deeper level to the ancestry.
yeah.
Um, and it's just like, it's been transformative. It's really allowed me to dig deep and understand my own patterns of behavior. And I'm like, oh, that is some intergenerational
Mm.
trauma that I'm repeating, or I'm doing this thing that I see in my family. And I think that it really changes the way I interact with my supervisees, because I've been really working to go into each relationship with my supervisees, remembering that everyone brings their own constellation of identities and the relationships to their identities into the experience of supervision.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think I've been encouraging my clients through my own work on myself is trying to encourage them or guide them in the process of knowing themselves if they'd like to dig further, deeper
Mhm.
into that. Because I do think I see the power in how that can help you relate to your clients and communities or identify processes like transference and countertransference.
Yeah. That's so important. I wish I could, tell my students or supervisees how important it is for them to understand their own identity. Before trying to understand their clients' identities, I think it's so important for one to know who they are to begin with. That's where it really starts. But I think often our supervisees are very focused on understanding our clients without realizing that they really have to start from themselves. And I think that's something that's tough to teach.
Yes, I completely agree with
Mhm.
you. And I think I've definitely noticed that in my years of supervision. Just, uh, yeah, I think the willingness to want to go into self and the readiness for it can be a tough thing and be a
Mhm.
really challenging thing to overcome in the supervisory process.
I agree. Yeah. And it's not just for students of color either. It's really also, it includes white students because a lot of times white students don't necessarily have a strong, maybe cultural or ethnic identities that they identify with. So it makes it really hard for them to understand what it means to have a cultural or ethnic identity or connection.
Yes, I completely agree with
Yeah.
that. Yeah, absolutely. And even encouraging that, I think, is so important. Like, where do you find connectedness? That's sort of a question that I've been trying to sort of pose to my supervisees, to dig deeper into that, because I
Mhm.
agree with you. I think it can be a really sensitive topic sometimes for some white students to think about um, the history of colonization,
Mhm.
where they might fit into that, and dismiss their own connections or experiences as a result too.
Mhm. Yeah, those are some difficult conversations. Indeed. Um, well, doing all this work, this difficult work that we're talking about with our supervisees, what are some obstacles and barriers? I suppose they're sort of at multiple levels, both individual, institutional, and maybe even cultural. What are some of these challenges that you have encountered as a supervisor and, um, you know, especially in the context of training your supervisees to be multiculturally competent?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think we alluded to my answer around that a couple
Yes.
seconds ago
Yeah.
last month. But I think one barrier can just be the student's sort of willingness or readiness to engage with that identity exploration. Uh,
Mhm.
and it can be, I think, hard to create a space that feels safe for everyone, regardless of identity. And so spending a bit of time in that group supervision to like build that group cohesion, I think
Mhm.
is really important. And recognizing that each group's going to look different. So just because let's say like 2 years ago, my group looked this way, it doesn't mean that this group's going to look that
Yeah.
way. And really remembering to meet them where they're at. And I think feeding into that, and maybe this is individual, institution, and cultural barrier, but I think capacity is a really big barrier. And I think what I mean by that is that I think the personal work can be really taxing on top of sort of the other responsibilities that our grad students have.
Mhm.
And so often, I know it's hard for us too, and we burn out, but
Yeah.
so often when students are talking about like not having capacity or being incredibly burnt out between the systems that we've created for them. So having to do classwork and clinical work and live their life outside of all this and remember that they're still a person outside of all of this too, I think can be hard. And adding in sort of that deep dive into the intersection of identities, I think can be really triggering and heavy for some students and really challenging. So
Mhm.
I think a way I conceptualize this work is maybe the challenging of ourselves in this context is not always something we can do, but I really like to emphasize if we do lean into challenging ourselves in that way, how can we also regulate ourselves? So like we're
Mhm.
not just doing a deep dive and then like not coming up for for air.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I've been trying to think of it like that. And like if we're willing to be vulnerable and do this work, how can we also still take care of ourselves while we do this work?
Mhm.
Um, and I guess the last barrier that I was kind of thinking of is related to the capacity piece, is just sort of, I feel like sometimes my students have talked about not always having supervisors or professors that might look like them, for example, or really seem to have the life experiences that fit with theirs. And
Yeah.
I know that might not be possible for every single person, but I think they've brought up things that have had me thinking about the field, I guess, and the institutional barriers, is
Mhm.
that sometimes it seems like there could be a slight disconnect or a disconnect between the academic side of things and how that feeds into the clinical side of things. So often I have my students arrive on in the first few weeks really excited about providing evidence-based frameworks to clients. And then all of a sudden they're like, wait, why didn't this work with my 15-year-old client who just moved here from Syria? And I think that that is sometimes a barrier, that it's really hard in the academic setting to sort of like tailor all evidence-based frameworks or prioritize adjusting these evidence-based frameworks to people from different walks of life. And
Mhm.
I see that as a barrier sometimes when I'm
Mhm.
supervising.
Mhm. Yeah. Do you mean that when they were in classrooms working with professors or being taught by professors who may not share similar experiences, so then the supervisees or students that you have, they never learn to make appropriate cultural modifications with some evidence-based interventions?
Yeah, that's what I mean. I see that as a pattern sometimes. And it's not to say that the teachers aren't doing the best that they can. And I know it's hard to sort of address every single identity or
Yeah.
cultural group. But it's sort of a theme that I've noticed both in their verbal feedback and just how it comes out in their practice at the beginning is struggling at the very beginning to sort of identify the different contexts in which a person lives, and then how to take the evidence-based framework and make it applicable for them, or to adjust and use something completely different even.
Mhm. Yeah, that's such an important point. Especially, these days, there's such a, kind of pull for evidence-based practice. And a lot of times people think of, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy for evidence-based practice. And some people, I think, are under the impression that CBT, because there has been so much research done, that it transcends maybe culture or any kind of difference really. And so they sit in their classrooms in CBT classes and learn all the different interventions without realizing that they have to also think about culturally responsive interventions or culturally responsive CBT. So it makes sense that the students never really learned it until they're actually working with people from diverse backgrounds.
Absolutely, absolutely. You explained that perfectly. That's what I've been noticing.
Yeah, yeah, it's such an important point, especially since they're now starting to work with clients, applying what they have learned in the classrooms and so on. So I'm so glad they have a supervisor like you who can do that. That's really excellent. um, and so I think along the same lines, you've already started to kind of talk about it, from thinking about some of the challenges, obstacles, and barriers. We're interested in knowing what has worked for you and what has not in terms of working with your supervisees in these challenging situations.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Mhm.
think one of the biggest things is, we talked about it a little bit already, is that group cohesion or building the relationships with my supervisees so that it feels safe enough in the first place to even start having these conversations.
Yeah.
I think it can be really hard on day one to bust that out. And so
Yes.
yeah, I really try to be like, okay, how can I connect with this person or create some kind of safety here? And so often I'll do a way to kind of create safety is like sort of rituals at the beginning or at the end of individual and group supervision, just asking questions that help them to connect to themselves. So like having them kind of identify like how they're feeling that day or challenges they might be facing or things that might be going well, things
Mhm.
they might be looking forward to, a way that they took care of themselves last week, a show they might be watching. And
Oh, yeah.
yeah, and like maybe just I guess priming that recognition of self there too, and the camaraderie between us.
Mhm.
So I found that really helpful. And then once I've kind of established those relationships to some degree, I think something else that's been really helpful for my students is just naming explicitly what might be going on. And I know last year and the year before, with like a lot of the racial violence going on, coming into supervision and creating a space and naming it felt, I want to say, it helped my students. They gave me feedback on this and they said that it helped them feel seen and heard
Mm.
rather than sort of continuing with like business as usual, and giving options to either share what they're feeling or stay silent and not share, or maybe turn the camera off if they need a break, but
Mhm.
be there to listen. And so I found that naming it can be really helpful as well, and allowing exploration from that place too.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I especially like your first point about really connecting on a personal level, right? I think it's really telling them that they're people and we care about them, and they're before being a clinician, they're a person too. And that I think because sometimes we're very focused on accomplishing tasks at hand, that sometimes we forget to connect with them on a personal level.
Yes, I completely agree.
Yeah, that's really important.
Yeah, I think it can be so hard for students sometimes too to remember that they're people
Yes.
and they're like, oh, you're asking me about something I like to do.
Yes, I actually care about you. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't want you to burn out.
Yeah, that's for me to also remember as well. Um, so then how have you been able to recognize and integrate the various social contexts and intersectionality issues? I noticed that intersectionality was one of your kind of interests. Um, and in terms of working with supervisees, especially those supervisees who may not believe that they're directly impacted by, for example, systemic racism or issues of equity and social justice. In general, what has been the most difficult challenge for you? And what is an example of a time where you were successful in helping your supervisee grow in their multicultural competence? Wow, that's a long question.
It's a good pile of questions.
Yeah.
I feel really fortunate to be working at DePaul FCS, the Family and Community Services. I think that DePaul in general and also my supervisor, Dr. Orson Morrison, do a really nice job of pushing diversity trainings and
Mhm.
enforcing that everyone is there. And I think given that community mental health context, conversations and learning around intersectionality is interspersed regularly through our in-service didactics and our larger trainings. We have 3 larger trainings per year.
Mm.
And it's also a topic that I bring up often in individual and group supervisions in the context of case conceptualizations and treatment plans, especially given the clients that we have coming to our clinic. Who are often clients who've experienced trauma or live in lower socioeconomic areas, might not have at the same type of resources as someone living in a different area of the
Yeah.
city.
Mm.
And so I think something that's been helpful is that we often look at how we conduct intake assessments. We've been really questioning the way we ask questions and digging that apart in our diversity trainings, which has felt really applicable. And then translating that to how do we conceptualize our cases? How do we take in different contextual factors? And then how do we select a treatment and recognize when a treatment might be working or not working, and looking at that course of therapy. And so I have been, I don't know that I've experienced a supervisee who doesn't believe that they're directly impacted per se by systemic racism.
Really?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm surprised.
I know, I'm surprised too. I was just wondering why that is. And I think DePaul tends to attract students that have sort of like a baseline understanding of this already.
Yeah.
And so I've even noticed, even with students that I've worked with who have maybe more dominant intersections of identities, they're often really willing to dig into to how this operates for them or their clients. And I mean, I think we're all constantly evolving, or there's layers to the work, but I don't know that I've worked with someone who's been, I do not want to do this, or like, I don't agree with what we're doing here. So yeah, I don't know if I've faced that, but there are definitely places where I think supervisees have grown in their multicultural competence. And I think an example I can kind of give is, yeah, I have a supervisee who's working with a client from a South Asian background. And this particular client, a teenage boy, talks often about how he feels weak when he expresses his emotions, mostly because his dad says that. His dad's like, men don't express emotions, that's weak. And and then another thing is that the client is afraid to share his emotions or how he feels or his thoughts with his father. And so I've been working with my supervisee to conceptualize this case and pick treatments. And my supervisee initially was thinking about how it might be appropriate to teach the client assertiveness skills. And very well so. Like, I totally understand where that's coming from. But then I kind of opened the conversation around exploring the possible role of gender and culture or respect for elders on the client's functioning, and sort of the roles of these contexts. So is it helpful if we just teach the client assertiveness skills and then have the client go to father and say these things? Or are we sort of impinging on a core cultural belief? And so I think my supervisee did a really nice job of reflecting on their own biases in this situation, and sort of looking at their own natural assumptions or tendencies to explain that it's okay for boys to show emotions or assert their feelings. And we discussed in supervision how to sort of tailor these treatments to be more culturally sensitive, and kind of rested on how it'd be helpful to explore the role of culture and gender in the client's own life and the meaning of these things specifically for the client. So how much value does the client place on appearing strong? What does strong mean to the client? What makes a boy strong or weak in the client's eyes? And what is the client's sort of like degree or level of internalization of cultural dynamics, such as respect for elders? Like, is that something that's really important for him? And do we want to make sure we don't step on the toes of that and work actually within these contexts to alleviate distress?
Yeah, that's such a great example. And it's very specific too, right? Because I think many of our students, their kind of first step in these situations is how can we bring about change for our client without really thinking about the contextual variables. And also thinking about kind of the question of why, right? Why in this particular culture? What's the historical background, right? And why it may be not necessarily an appropriate thing to be assertive with one's father. And where does that come from? How does it's not just that action, but the whole culture itself, I think the students really need to think about. And that's not an easy task, really.
No, it's not easy. I think it can often leave supervisees, and I've experienced this too with my own biases, feeling sort of powerless in the situation, and just feeling ineffectual in creating change. But I do really love what you're saying about taking in the contextual factors into account and how you can still provide support. So maybe discussing conflict resolution strategies rather than teaching assertiveness skills.
Yes, yeah, such a valuable lesson. Yeah, and I do love some of the more specific examples, right? Like what you can do with a particular student who has a particular kind of intervention in mind, and how we can try to contextualize that together. That's really wonderful. In general, as a supervisor, how do you promote or teach culturally responsive interventions? We talked about some already from the example that you gave, but in general, how do you teach them culturally responsive interventions? And what are some of your favorites? What has worked for you as a supervisor?
Yeah. So I think a way that we do it often is the in-service trainings. And this year I have a bit of a different role, along with being a staff psychologist, is taking on the role of diversity coordinator. So I've been trying to infuse more teaching, I guess, into the curriculum that I think would be helpful, and also talking to the students too about what would be helpful. So we've landed on creating a series of in-service trainings for working with youth that have LGBTQ plus identities.
Yeah.
Because I think, at least for us, often we might have a in-service, like one in-service on it, but I mean, that community is so large. And I think that we've glossed it over. So I have a team of students working with me to create these in-services, and I'm really excited about it. I think it'll be about 3 or 4 series where we isolate different areas and get into it more. So that's a way. The large trainings, we have 3 large diversity trainings a year too, where our topic this year is focusing on colonization within ourselves in the field, and then how do we decolonize.
Yeah.
And so I think we've been talking a lot about, I think I shared earlier a lot about just sort of interrupting our own automatic processes. Like we have our own paperwork, but how can we make this better? Is our paperwork dismissing or denying a client's experiences? Can we ask these questions better? So we've been brainstorming together on that.
Mhm.
And often through individual, group, and case conceptualization. So we do a lot of different types of activities in the trainings and the supervisions, like looking at activities that center the intersection of identities, having each student sort of explore what identities they think about often, what they might not think about often, how that might impact how they work with a client, for example.
Mhm.
And something else that I think has been helpful in the larger trainings to sort of have everyone participate if they'd like is we've been doing the larger trainings virtually because of space
Oh,
limitations.
yes,
And
yeah.
yeah, and we've been using Mentimeter to allow anonymous participation when we ask sort of tougher open-ended questions. And yeah, I think that's been really nice. I don't think I realized that until the virtual world, how that's been a really nice way to access students that might not feel comfortable speaking up in the larger group,
Mhm. Mhm.
especially if they don't necessarily share the same views as the majority of the group. And I've definitely noticed that it's allowed more people to participate or engage. And I'm hoping that that's something that they carry with them outside of the larger trainings because they've had the space to sort of go through it in the virtual.
Mhm. Wow, that's such a wonderful idea, right? Who would have thought being virtual would have something that's beneficial? Yeah, that's really wonderful that you're able to use that. I had never heard of it before.
Yeah, one of my students actually told me about it. I feel like they're way more tech savvy than I
Uh-huh.
am, but it's
Mhm.
called Mentimeter and it's really great. You can come up with open-ended questions and then have people just type out their answers there in
Yeah,
the comments.
anonymously, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful tool. That could really facilitate some really difficult dialogues. Yeah, and maybe help or encourage students to continue on their journey really. Because I think that's so important to continue. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon, it's, essentially. And so I think it's important for students to continue not only with you, but once they leave your site, once they become, licensed, once they become supervisors of their own and so on. It's so important to continue.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good tool. Um, let's see. Well, this is actually one of my favorite questions, which is, how do your students or supervisees translate their awareness and knowledge to action when it comes to providing culturally adaptive interventions? Um, I think for a long time, our field really focused on raising people's awareness about whether it's cultural identity or equity, social justice or discrimination. I think a lot of it was really focused on becoming more aware, gaining more insight, and so on. But then something kind of got lost along the way. And I think that many of our students or supervisees don't really know necessarily how to translate their newly gained awareness into action, different behavior, right? Different decisions and choices and so on. So how do you help your supervisees do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with what you're saying. And I think this can be one of the more challenging things, like you said, and also a really cool thing to watch the
Yeah,
supervisors go
yeah.
through the process of figuring out how to do it. And I think I have a couple like shorter examples about it, but I was thinking about sort of the process of therapy too, from initial intake to course of treatment. And
Mhm.
something that my supervisee did at the beginning of treatment with one of her clients that I thought was really great was she was given a case transfer at the beginning of the school year. And this particular client is transgender and went by a name different than the name given at birth. And through the paperwork from the previous clinician, my supervisee was given pronouns and the name information, and could have easily just made an assumption moving forward about what names and pronouns are. But in that first meeting, she did a really wonderful job of clarifying and actually just asked the client what was true for them, and found out that the client was using birth name, in fact, instead of the name that was given to my supervisee. And so I think it's something, when she told me that, I was like, oh, that's awesome. Like that's, I think something that could easily be taken for granted, that we have this information, and it's just like a simple checking in even. And I think that could be really validating for a client. And I think another way that I've noticed my supervisees working to translate awareness and knowledge into action is working on more systemic levels to address distress. So rather than just targeting symptoms per se on their own, which can be incredibly important to regulate emotions, but working on addressing distress through contextual lenses. So one of my supervisees had an adult client that needed help with securing disability payments and was just completely overwhelmed with the paperwork, and is she has fibro, she's in a lot of pain, for example, and also a single parent. And so there was just a lot on her plate. And one of the sessions was spent with my supervisee working through the paperwork together. And then she was able to secure some disability payments, which helped immensely with working through a bit of the financial difficulties. And I think that is a really helpful way to culturally adapt interventions sometimes.
Yes, yes, yeah, that's so important, right? Because looking at it from your client's perspective, what would be most helpful, rather than us thinking about we deciding this what might be most helpful for our clients. Both of your dog agrees.
He definitely agrees. I'm sorry. One second.
No, it's okay. It's fine.
So sorry about that.
Okay. It's totally fine. It happens all the time. Yeah. Yeah, so I really love that. I love those two examples, how your supervisees were able to make those kinds of decisions, use their clinical judgment in the moment to really determine what would be most helpful and important to their clients. I guess that's how you translate awareness into action.
I hope so. I feel like that's one of the most difficult things, though, and there's so many ways to do it. And I definitely agree with you. I think something I've been focusing on too is just exactly what you said, like what is most important for the client right now, and how can we maybe meet them there?
Yeah, that's hard, especially like with the paperwork case. It's so important for the client, but I think as clinicians, it doesn't occur to us sometimes that that's what we need to do. We are often thinking about kind of psychologically minded interventions, and so we don't often think about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, good. We're getting some good examples here. You know, as a clinician, supervisor, and teacher, this is such an important question, especially in the context of what's been happening in the past 2 years, is that, you know, what do you do or how do you take care of yourself? Self-care is obviously really important. And we're curious as to what you recommend for your supervisees, but also what you do to take good care of yourself and what supports you have, And what are some barriers maybe to practicing self-care on a regular basis for you, given our schedules, our commitments, and so on?
It's a great question. I think that what I often recommend to my students is some sort of release or therapy practice for themselves. So whether it's seeing their own therapist or cooking food or taking a walk or laying in bed for 5 extra minutes, just finding a way to connect to themselves every day in their own process.
Hmm.
And I also think it's really important. Oh no, I lost my train of thought, but
Mhm.
Setting boundaries, I think,
Oh,
can be
yeah.
important. So that's often work that I do with my supervisees too, because I think that the tendency is that they're really quick to say yes to things that clients ask of them,
Mhm.
like really big schedule changes or things like that. And then all of a sudden they're burnt out. And so we've been doing a lot of work on identifying like what is your boundary here, and then how do you communicate that to your
Mhm.
clients.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
that's so important because especially since a lot of us are working from home virtually, we feel the pressure to be really available at any time of the day or night, for that matter. And so I don't think it's just students who are struggling to set boundaries. It's really all of us.
I completely agree. I
Yeah,
completely agree. I try to model it for them and sometimes fail
yeah.
at it myself, but it's always a work in progress. And we've been working on sharing times where it's gone well and things that we're still struggling with in supervision.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I've settled on for taking care of myself, which is very difficult, and sometimes it goes better than others. And I've learned the hard way a couple of times.
Yeah.
But I just like really try to identify where I'm at. And I think the yoga training has been really helpful for me. It's allowed me to kind of give myself space to just be way more aware of what my body's telling me and what might be coming up for me, and like whether I want to sit in it or push it down for a moment or release it or move with it. And so I think that's been a helpful philosophy to take into self-care. And things that I like to do, I like moving my body. So like a lot of like physical activity, walking and biking, and then trying to do it in a way that feels more mindful. So rather than like rigorously running, maybe I'll take a long walk instead.
Yeah, yeah. People do all kinds of things like run a marathon or something. Yeah.
Right,
Mhm.
right. And then reading for pleasure, that actually came back strangely enough in the time of pandemic, because
Mhm.
I had some like a lot more time at home and I found myself going back to reading, which was really nice. And
Mhm. Mhm.
connecting with others. I think using my own healing practices, and right now that is mostly yoga, acupuncture, and journaling.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's been very helpful for
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, part of our podcast series also includes doing experientials. And the other two who are involved in the project, Cynthia Langtu and Kristen Velasquez Kennefic, um, they will be doing some experientials for the podcast too, such as mind and body mindfulness exercises, or progressive muscle relaxation, and all kinds of experientials that could be used by supervisors when they supervise other supervisees, or just on their own in terms of self-care. So self-care really is extremely important.
I agree. I completely agree. That's so wonderful. I think,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think the largest barrier is time, in all honesty. I think we're just like you said, especially with the virtual piece of it, maybe feeling that pressure to respond at all times to
Mhm,
anyone who's contacting. And I think time can be a large barrier, or our perception of it, that
mhm. Yeah.
I have to be working all the time, and like when can I do this thing for myself or spend time with someone I care about.
Yes, yeah, that's tough. Yeah. But I do agree with you that it's extremely helpful to model for your supervisees, right? And because they learn from observing, right? They learn by watching. And so that is really helpful to think about. How can I embody some of the things that I try to teach my supervisees? Yeah.
I try.
Yeah. Well, the next question is kind of related to self-care, but what keeps you going in your journey? We briefly talked about earlier how it's a marathon, not a sprint, and it's a journey. How do you continue to stay encouraged and hopeful despite setbacks, especially in the most recent political and social climate? Um, I think keeping it going is one thing, but also feeling encouraged or continuing to feel hopeful is a whole another challenge for a lot of us. So, yes, please tell us how you do that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for better or for worse, I have sort of an optimistic nature. So I feel like I'm a lover of humanity or a
Mhm.
believer in the inner wisdom that might sort of be or reside in all of us. And I think I have my own spiritual beliefs that keep
Mhm.
me going. So for example, I feel like I connect to nature really deeply and find a lot of hope and inspiration there. So when I'm feeling really low or burnt out, or completely demoralized by the political and social climate,
Mhm.
just gaining or garnering inspiration from the constant change that nature undergoes, like the seasons, or something as simple as like the leaves falling off a
Yeah.
tree, moon cycles, and just like it reminds me that humans are similar in the ways that we're always changing or constantly evolving, and that we're not staying static. And that gives me hope that there's room for us to expand our minds and our hearts. And I try to hold on to that when I'm feeling at my lowest. And
Mhm. Mhm.
yeah, it's not always easy. There are, of course, days where one would feel, or myself would feel really deeply sad or frustrated, hopeless, angry, exhausted, just seeing how these systems act on us,
Yeah.
students, clients. But
Mhm.
I think thinking about the expansiveness and the constant change to things gives me hope that we can continue to build more sustainable systems.
Mhm. Yeah, I love your idea about connecting to nature. Right. Especially how we can observe the changes in nature, right? Every season, things seem to change without a doubt. And so that is such a wonderful way to think about humanity also, that there's a constant force of change. I forget that sometimes.
Yeah, me too. But
Yeah.
then I always get reminded, like you said, by nature. I'll go
Mhm.
outside and be like, oh, this is constantly changing.
Yeah, exactly. That's such a good reminder. Like you said, even just to like a walk
Mhm.
for a brief moment really could help, right? In so many different ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a good point. I'm gonna try that. um, and then we're coming to one of the last questions. There's so much to learn. Speaking of, being on a journey, um, are you interested in further training in this area, culturally responsive supervision, or a related field as well? And what would help you to become a better supervisor, more competent clinician, and so on? What would be kind of your dream list of things that you could do?
Absolutely. I love this question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in further training, like the whole lifelong learner approach. I think something that has been really inspiring and helpful is taking stock of the different types of training or events going on around the city right now. So there's a lot of different talks or webinars that discuss holistic healing practice and how to embody them.
Hmm.
And Dr. Morrison and I have been sort of co-exploring what's going on in the city.
Yeah.
It's been helpful, and I really like that, because I think, like we talked about earlier, the more one can connect to self, whether it's us as supervisors or having our supervisees connect to themselves, I think it can really help in connection to clients, and helping to hold that space for clients.
Hmm.
And so I think training in those areas would be really nice way to continue to expand my my culturally responsive supervision and
Yeah.
treatment. Just learning about treatments or holistic approaches that work for my own culture, but also other cultures too.
Yeah. Yeah. What have you found so far
Yes,
around the area?
yeah. Have you heard of Chicago Mines?
I think I have. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they're really awesome, and I think they started over the pandemic
Oh,
actually.
really? Uh-huh.
Yeah. And they put on different events and they're having I forget exactly what it's called, but on December 11th, it's a free event for clinicians of color. And it's just sort of like a menu of different types of holistic healing practices that you can sign up for and experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's things like sound healing or yoga movement,
Uh-huh.
and art or music. And I'm very excited for it, and I can absolutely send you a link if you're.
Yes, yeah, please do. Our other collaborator, Kristen Velasquez Kennefic, she's actually a yoga movement therapist as well. She-
Amazing.
yeah, yeah, she did that. She trained to become, um, you know, completed her training, and she did that in the past 5 years.
Oh, that's so exciting to me. I think it makes me so happy to meet clinicians who are also learning about other ways to heal,
Mhm,
and I
mhm.
think things like the trainings to do so with themselves and their clients.
Yeah, yeah, that's wonderful. So finding these different kinds of opportunities where you live, right, and nearby, and participating, that's really helpful. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Are there other things that you're looking for or that might help you or
Yeah, I think readings in general, I have a whole list of books that I have that I need to still read, and or books that I'd like to get. And I think just further expanding my knowledge in different types of areas that would encompass culturally responsive care would be really helpful. Um,
Mhm.
and continue to expand my own thinking or practices around it.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that I want to put more effort in is
Mhm.
picking something and starting to read through it.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite book or something that you would recommend not only to your supervisees, but also other supervisors who are interested in culturally responsive care?
Yeah, My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menakem is
Oh,
really awesome, and talks a lot about how we hold trauma in different parts of our bodies, and so a lot of it is somatic based, and kind of discusses how mindfulness practices don't always feel safe for people who have experienced deep trauma, and kind of provides alternatives to how you can engage in mindfulness practices through a body-centered way.
oh wow.
Yeah, so that one's really cool. And then there's decolonizing trauma therapy as well, uh,
Hmm.
which I also really like. And that one is tailored more towards working with First Nations or Native American population.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are really interesting books. Yeah, definitely put them on my list as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Do you have any favorites that you would recommend?
Um, it's not a book, but recently I heard Beverly Tatum speak. I don't know if you like her work or not. She's the author who wrote many years ago this book called Why Do Black Kids Always Sit Together at the Cafeteria or something like that. She does a lot of work on dismantling racism, recognizing stereotypes. She actually was the president of Spelman College a few years ago, and she's a psychologist. I recently saw a webinar by her, and I don't know if you heard of this analogy, but she talked about this moving walkway at the airport. Have you heard of it?
I have, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that really moved me so much. She talked about how, in the context of becoming anti-racist person or psychologist and so on, you know how the moving walkway, the conveyor belt, there are people who are actually walking fast on the conveyor belt to get to like where they want to go versus someone who is like standing still. Someone who's walking fast is kind of active person, actively perpetuating the cycle of racism. Someone who's kind of standing still on the walkway, they're not actively doing something, but they still get to the same place. So they're kind of more like passive racist. In order to become an anti-racist, you have to walk against the walkway, the conveyor belt, and walk faster than the conveyor belt goes. And she described that's what it takes to dismantle racism and to become a anti-racist. I thought that was such a beautiful analogy.
I completely agree. Even you outlining it right now, I have chills.
Yes, thanks to Beverly Tatum. Yes, so I recommend anything she writes or any webinars that she has. She's absolutely amazing.
Thank you so much.
Yes, yeah. Well, that concludes our interview. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you. I learned so much from you, and I have so many different ideas that I'd like to try based on what you said today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bay. It's been so wonderful to be here with you.
Yes, I really do hope that our paths cross again, and hopefully we'll be able to update you when the podcasts have been completed and edited. You'll be first to know, and we will contact you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I appreciate it deeply. I appreciate the work that you're doing.
Yes, thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.